Chris, how do we respond to the claim that the United States is the greatest country ever to exist when it openly rejects the kingship of Christ? It's very applicable in an election year, I would think.
Well, the United States is simply not the greatest country that ever existed. But what is the situation in the Western world as a whole? Well, I wrote an article for The Remnant, but I think the title was, "We're All Freemasons Now," because we all live under the framework that they conceived of, which began with the philosophy of John Locke and Hobbes, the founders of liberalism, and was put into implementation in the American Revolution about 70 or 80 years later. The idea that the representative of the people expresses the will of the people, and the majority rule determines public policy and even morality itself, and that's the framework we have to live with. Now, in terms of the Constitution, if you're going to have that kind of government, the document is an absolute masterpiece of legal draftsmanship. The only thing that saved us from the last presidential election being a disaster was the Electoral College. So that's one element of why this is a document that can be considered a legal masterpiece. The framers of this document recognized that if population alone, in other words, the direct election of the president, were the standard, then giant states would dominate every presidential election. And every election would be determined by New York and California. So the Electoral College saved us from the worst aspects of the very system the framers erected. And we have to live with it. Cardinal Ottaviani said something quite famous about that. He said, "It should not surprise you that we appeal to the rights of man when the rights of God are not recognized." And Leo said the same thing in Libertas. He said we have to make use of these cankered modern liberties, as he called them, without violating our conscience, in an effort to bring back society to the form and pattern of Christianity. So we work within that framework because we have no choice. We can't become revolutionaries and take up arms against the government.
I would just comment also, I don't know if, again, if you want to add anything, Chris, be happy if you would, but I just want to make it clear for all of the faithful, because I don't know that this is clear, and it's that the United States was not founded on, let's say, true Catholic social principles, namely true Catholic belief that Christ is king. You have any number of encyclicals, even just the ones I think that Chris referenced, well, maybe not so much Libertas, but certainly it's Quas Primas, right? Is Quas Primas Pius the 11th on Christ the King? So you got Quas Primas. You certainly have another one by Leo the 13th. Immortale, yeah, thank you. Immortale Dei by Leo the 13th. In other words, you have very clear papal teaching on the kingship of our Savior Jesus Christ. And so I do think it is important for us as Catholics to recognize this, because if we recognize this as Catholics, I think we're going to be very careful about, making these claims about, the United States is, the greatest country. Did they say in the history of the, yeah. I mean, you just simply can't say that as a Catholic. I mean, especially when you look at, the great saintly kings, like in France and, the Holy Roman Empire and all this. Certainly David will know a lot more on this in terms of just the history. But it just is important, because I have noticed that there are very few Catholics, and even I think a lot of times maybe among traditional Catholics, that are not clear on the traditional social teaching of the Catholic Church, where for us as Catholics, I mean, we have to understand that, again, liberty, this thing about freedom is not what's most important. I mean, what's most important is that we honor Christ as our King and that we submit to Him. And the Pope's explained this beautifully in these encyclicals. But again, I think it is important to know that. I mean, Chris talks about how, this is the reality that we have, and, we got to work with what we have. And I think that's true, but at the same time, I also think it's true that we understand that the way that our country was founded, the United States was founded, is wrong. It's wrong according to Catholic Church teaching. And so there was another question sometime, I think it was yesterday, about should we pray for like peace, and should we also pray, make petitions for these great global things? And I would say this is something that we should definitely be praying for. I mean, certainly I think in some way it may work into the consecration of Russia to the Immaculate Heart of Mary, and the conversion and the triumph of the Immaculate Heart of Mary, where we'll once again have true Catholic nation states. I mean, I think it's also a disgrace what happened in the post-Vatican II period with pretty much the last Catholic states that existed. I think probably Colombia maybe, Colombia maybe, and Spain.
Spain.
So yeah, Spain and Colombia, where they still had a Catholic constitution, where the Catholic faith was still respected. See, the way our country really should be in terms of being Catholic is that it should recognize the true religion, which is the Catholic religion. The other religions are false religions. This idea about all religions are equal, that's not Catholic. It goes completely contrary to the Catholic religion. And this is why I wanted to emphasize this, because, I mean, so many Catholics think, well, again, like as an American, I have to respect all religions. That's crazy. I'd say, you don't respect all religions. How are you going to respect a religion that's false? How are you going to respect a religion that denies Christ? Now, I would say we respect the persons. We're not going to be condemning, people and all these things, but we do have to point out to them, look, if you believe in a false religion, well, it's a false religion and you have to convert. So that's my 2 cents worth.
I would just add that I agree, except that in order to have a Catholic confessional state, you need Catholics. And the problem...
Excellent point, Chris.
And so until the nation undergoes a metanoia and everybody converts, there's no prospect of that. But not only Catholics, but Protestants recognized the social kingship of Christ as something that ought to have been mentioned in the founding documents, the failure of which was a fatal defect. There was a movement of Protestants in the 1860s called the National Reform Association. It's in a book I wrote about the whole subject of liberty. They had conventions, and the purpose of the conventions was to amend the preamble to the Constitution to state that the revealed will of Christ is the law of the land. Protestants, these were Presbyterians, and they submitted this proposed amendment to Abraham Lincoln. And he said, oh, very interesting. And they submitted it to Congress, where it was tabled and never allowed to proceed to a vote that would have begun the amendment process. But these Protestants predicted that if the Constitution failed to recognize that the revealed will of Christ is the law of the land, it was only a matter of time before America became, to quote one of their statements, a Christless, godless blank. So even Protestants recognize this. We're not special pleading when we say this.
I think one of the things we also have to really do, again, is distinguish. So anytime you engage, I'll use my sports analogy again, we all sit around and we say, who's the greatest quarterback, who's the greatest football player, the greatest whatever, right? And immediately the first discussion is, well, what criteria are you going to use? Super Bowl rings, yards, completions, blah, blah, blah. So when we say the greatest nation, what's the criteria that we're using? Too many people, I think, are using worldly criterias. Power, money, military might. But is that really what makes us great? What is it that makes the Catholic, or the human being, not the Catholic, the human being flourish? It's the transcendentals that make us like God. Truth, goodness, and beauty. And so the culture that enables man to aspire to greater truth, to greater goodness, and to greater beauty in the arts, in the sciences, and culture, and everything, that is the great nation. And so there's actually an historian, I like her, Diane Moscar. She often writes in the Latin Mass magazine these little articles that are called Greatest When Catholic. And she studies the history of nations, and she shows that the height of their civilization is when they were the most Catholic. And it's on these principles of like truth and goodness and beauty. And as fathers mentioned, when you have men like Ferdinand III in Spain or Louis IX in France, right? King Edward the Saint in England, Henry II, the Emperor of Germany. I mean, those were the great nations because they were creating cultures that fostered saints, heroic virtue. So I think that's our criteria, but you're not going to be able to engage in this discussion with someone if you don't set the parameters first. So you say it's greatest nation, how are we going to evaluate what's greatest? Who's got the most money? Who's got the most power? Who's got the most virtue? Who's got the truth, the goodness, and the beauty?
Hey, but we got a Catholic president.
Now, yeah, If you are interested in making a buck, America is the greatest nation in the history of the world. And that's basically how Gordon Wood ends his book, The Radicalism of the American Revolution. He talks about the lowliness of American democracy, but boy, if you want to make some money, this is the land of opportunity. No doubt about that.
Father, do you want to say something?
Well, yeah, just real quickly, just again to make it practical for the faithful, I want to try and drive this point home. Very recently, hopefully I'm not too fuzzy on the details or the names of the cases, but all of you know that it wasn't that long ago that the Supreme Court basically overturned Roe v. Wade and left the decision to the states. So again, a lot of even, I'd say, good Catholics were kind of praising this. Now again, I would agree, well, yeah, it's more positive than, let's say, the past. But as soon as that went down, I mean, I remember talking to a group of faithful and I was telling them, look, we've got still a massive problem because, and it's been playing out, because I told them, look, now what's going to happen if you get a lot of the states that, let's just say by popular vote or the legislatures, whatever it is, that let's say then legalize abortion. And I said, it's still completely wrong. You're still talking about a completely grave sin because, again, we could say here, applying it to the greatness of the nation, the greatness of the nation doesn't depend on, like, let's say democracy or the fact that the people can decide. It has to do with fidelity to the truth. Like David was talking about truth, goodness, beauty. And again, recognizing that Christ is king, we obey his law, that every single it's not just you as an individual person that have to submit to Christ, the king, and his law, the commands of God, to the truth, but every institution, including, again, civil state institutions. And so I say, well, you see that it's still so far from what is truly Catholic and what could be termed great with what's going on even right now in terms of just the specific abortion issue. Because, again, whatever, let's say the state of New York then legalizes abortion. That's still crazy. And how can you call your country great when this is being allowed? So.